All right, Shabbat Shalom and welcome to United Israel World Union, coming to you live from the historic Temple Sinai Synagogue in St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thanks to an arrangement with the Julius Freehand Foundation and the West Feliciana Historical Society. So we are glad to be here with you this morning. Welcome to those who are here in the synagogue with us in person, as well as those who have joined us on the Synagogue Without Walls. Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to ask Sherry to read for us this morning the 10 words and the Shema, because this is an ancient practice and we want to bring it back into the synagogue, and then we'll teach a class. So, Sherry?
Good morning. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home, when you're away, when you lie down, and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Deuteronomy 5, 6 through 9. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image, or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work, you, nor your son nor your daughter, your male nor female slave, your ox nor your ass, nor any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may long endure, and that you may fare well in the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, nor crave your neighbor's house, or his field, or his male or female slave, or his ox or his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's.
Thank you, Sherry. Okay. So I wanted to say one thing this morning just by way of announcements, and that is that this coming Sabbath I will be performing a wedding, and so I will be out. And some of you know about our United Israel wedding that's taking place in North Carolina this coming week. So next Sabbath, next Sabbath, Dave and Sherry will be with Dave and Patty Tyler, and so they will be broadcasting live from there. So you will still have a place to go. You'll just be in New York next week. It'll be a little bit cooler there, I can imagine. So just wanted to make that announcement and look forward to doing a wonderful wedding next week. So this particular week, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that this week is the longest Torah portion in Genesis. It's 154 verses long. It's the fourth longest in the entirety of the Torah cycle of readings, according to the annual cycle. There's a lot in this Torah portion, and so you can't possibly talk about everything that's contained within this parsha in the amount of time that I allot myself each week. So what I wanted to do was focus in on a particular part of this week's reading, and so I've entitled the class today, VaYishlach, which is the Hebrew word that we're going to talk about, and the return, Hosea and the return of Israel. Hosea and the return of Israel. This particular Torah portion starts off with trepidation. There is a good amount of fear as Jacob, after being gone for 20 years, is now preparing to face his brother. He doesn't know what to expect after being gone for 20 years. You'll recall that when he left, things were not so good between he and his sibling. And by the end of this reading, Deborah, Rachel, and Isaac will all be dead. So this particular Torah reading contains quite a bit. We're going to try to take a portion of this week's parsha and really zero in on it. And Jacob last week begins his way back home to the land of promise, to the land that was promised in this patriarchal plan to his father and to his grandfather. And so I wanted to pick up this morning in Genesis chapter 31. Now this comes from last week's Torah portion, but it's instrumental in setting up everything which I'm going to talk about today. So if you'll join me in Genesis chapter 31, and I just want to read verse 3. Genesis 31 and verse 3. And Jehovah said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. Shuv is the Hebrew word. Return. Jehovah speaks to Jacob, to Yaakov, and he tells him, return. He's very specific about where he wants him to go. He says, I want you to return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. And then later in the same chapter, if you'll go with me to Genesis chapter 31 and verse 13, we get this command again. In chapter 31 and verse 13, Jacob hears this: I am the God of Bethel, where you did anoint a pillar, and where you did vow a vow to me. Now rise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your birth. Now, this particular passage is interesting to me. Jacob is told he's addressed by one who refers to himself as the God of Bethel. He tells him, I want you to go back to the land of your birthings, if you will. And he talks about a previous incident. He talks about an anointing. He says, I'm the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and vowed a vow. When he tells him to go, that word is say. Now you remember in last week's Torah portion, vayetse, that particular word is based on the same root. And Jacob went to go forth. Now he says, arise, say, go from this land and shuv, return to the land of your nativity. And so from the outset this morning, what follows from the end of last week's parsha and into this week's portion deals primarily with the return of Jacob. And so this is going to be the point of focus for what follows in today's teaching, the idea of shuv, the idea of return, and specifically the return of Jacob. As I announced when I began in this morning's class, my title is The House, Hosea and the Return of Israel. I had another thought hit me. Hosea and the Return of Israel. Now, this particular reading, by the way, has two different haftarahs that are often associated with it. The Sephardic community will generally read the prophet Obadiah, the entirety of the prophet Obadiah in this week's Torah portion. And you will probably know that the reason that that's so connected with this particular Torah portion is that Obadiah deals with Edom, with Esau, with the descendants of Esau, which, by the way, by the end of this Torah portion, in chapter 36 of Genesis, we get the entire genealogy, if you will, of the family of Esau. Esau plays a very prominent role in this particular week's Torah portion. Remember, as Jacob prepares to go back, when he prepares to shuv, to return to the land of his nativity, he's worried. He's anxious. He's scared because he doesn't know what to expect when he encounters his brother. A couple of weeks ago, the Torah portion was from the book of Malachi, where we read in Malachi, Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. So one particular storyline, one particular class option would be to go with what the Sephardic community does and focus on the encounter with Esau. Now, we'll touch on that, but I'm looking at it from a different angle. Because the Ashkenazi read a different prophet reading with this particular Torah portion. They focus on Hosea chapter 12. Now, I've touched on a series of verses in Hosea chapter 12 the last few weeks because it's very important in terms of not only tying the historical narrative to the prophetic narrative, but I think it's one of those passages which really jumps off the page, particularly with me, because it deals with something that's so significant and so important to this story that we cannot let it lie. We have to look at it very closely. So in this particular week's teaching, I'll be going with the connection between Hosea chapter 12 and the return of Jacob. We're going to be looking at the historical narrative, but we're going to also be looking at some prophetic text, and we're going to be looking at them together, because I believe that together they represent a picture not only of the past, but also the future. Now, in this particular passage that I just read in Genesis chapter 31 and verse 13, where God reminds Jacob that he is to return to the place where he first encountered him. We look at this, and I want you to understand that this particular passage, Genesis chapter 31, verse 13, is Jacob relating yet another dream. If you remember, when he fled from his brother, VaYishlach, in Genesis chapter 28, and he goes to this certain place, and he puts down a stone and rests his head thereon, and he has a dream. And I taught last week that the entirety of the patriarchal plan hinges on a dream. So I want you to imagine that Jacob finds himself in the land of Padan Aram. There he serves for his women, and he spends 20 years there. And then he has a dream. And in this dream, he's told it's time to go back. In the dream, a malach ha-Elohim, a messenger, of the Elohim tells Jacob, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you vowed a vow to me. Now you'll recall that when he woke up from that dream in chapter 28 of Genesis, he recognized the awe associated with that encounter. And it says that he took the pillar and stood it up and poured oil upon it. In a sense, he makes a Messiah in the biblical sense. In other words, he anoints this object and he calls this place Bethel, the house of El. Now I want to go back. I want to go back because according to this dream in chapter 31, verse 13, this Malach tells him, I am the God of Bethel. And he says, you there anointed a pillar and you vowed a vow. I want to look at the vow. I want to go back and I want to look at that vow that Jacob made, because everything hinges on the dream and the subsequent vow that Jacob made. In other words, we could focus, as I pointed out, on this idea of Esau and Edom and Obadiah, this prophetic reading that is attached to this Torah portion by some. But I want to focus on the dream and the subsequent vow that Jacob makes. So I want you to go with me back to Genesis chapter 28. Now remember, biblically and chronologically, we're backing up at least 20 years from a time when Jacob is fleeing and he goes to this certain place. And remember, in this dream, he's promised by the God who speaks with him of two great patriarchal promises: progeny and property, seed and land. And both of these are to be taken in a very literal sense. He's told in the dream something very instructive. He says that your seed will spread abroad, is the way the Hebrew puts it, to the west and the east and the north and the south. I want to pick up this morning in verse 15. God tells Jacob, behold, I am with you, and I will keep you in all places to which you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I've done which I have spoken to thee of. And Jacob awakes. This promise in the dream is pretty incredible. He tells Jacob not only, now look at this, he says, I'm with you. To hear the words of the God of Bethel, to say that I am with you, seems that it would be sufficient. But he continues, and I will guard you in all the places to which you go. And that's even more than I'm with you. He says, I'm with you and I'll guard you wherever you go. And then it says even further, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I've done that which I have spoken to you of. What an incredible promise. The God of Bethel says that he's going to be with him and go with him and bring him back. Now I want you to look at verse 16, and we're going to get a little glimpse of Jacob's character, and it's going to build the scenario that I'm going to talk about today. Verse 16, Yaakov awoke out of his sleep, and he said, "Surely Jehovah is in this place, and I knew it not." And he was afraid and said, "How dreadful, how awesome is this place! This is no other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." And Yaakov rose up early in the morning, took the stone that he had put under his head, set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city was called Luz at the first. Now, what I want to do now is show you the vow that he makes. Upon his realization that this particular place is awesome, that it's the house of God, and that it's none other than the gate of heaven, he makes a vow. But I want you to listen to the vow that he makes. Beginning in verse 20. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, "If God will be with me, and will keep me in the way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then Jehovah shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And all that you shall give me, I will surely give a tenth to thee." Now, I touched on this last week, but I really want to look at it this morning. He's told by the God of Bethel, "I'm with you, I'll go with you, I'll protect you, I'll guard you, and I'll bring you back." Jacob hears all that. Jacob counters. He brings back to the one who spoke to him a few added details. And I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting for a lot of reasons. In particular, I think it helps us understand Jacob and the way that he operated. So he's told that God will be with him and guard him. And Jacob adds a detail to that. Notice he says, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go," that's what God had said. And he adds, here's what Jacob says, "and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear." He just wanted to make sure that was in the contract. And give me bread and clothing. And then he's told by God in the dream that God's going to cause him to return. And Jacob adds a detail. Notice what the detail is. "So that I come to my father's house in peace." He wants to make sure that the fine print includes not only that he'll return, but that he'll return in peace. Then, he says, if God is with me, if God guards me in the way and provides me food to eat and clothing to wear, if God will bring me back to my father's house in peace, then, Jacob says, Jehovah will be my God. This will be God's house, and I'll give a tenth to Jehovah. Very interesting. I don't know that I've noticed quite before how with everything that God promises to Jacob, Jacob adds a few details. I think in a way it shows that Jacob was very bold, very courageous, some might say audacious. The audacity that Jacob just wanted to make sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. Now, last week's Torah portion ends in Genesis chapter 32, just as it began. When Jacob departed and left his home en route to go to Padan Aram, to his mother's family, the house of Lavan, his mother's brother, he encounters messengers in the dream. You'll remember that when Jacob's dreaming, he sees a ladder extending from the earth to the heaven with messengers, translated in some translation as angels, ascending and descending. At the close of last week's Torah portion, as he is making his way back to the land of promise, being prompted in a dream to return, to shuv, return to the land of your birthings. Verse 1 of chapter 32, and Jacob went on his way. It says, and the angels of God met him, the Malachim. Now, we know that in Hebrew the word malach can mean a messenger. It can mean an angel, but what are we looking at here? Well, clearly in the dream in chapter 28, these messengers, whatever they are ascending and descending a ladder between earth and heaven. The Torah portion ends with Jacob encountering once again what the Hebrew text just simply says or calls Malachim. When he saw these messengers, he calls the name of this place Mahanaim. Look at verse 2 of chapter 32. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. Mahanaim means two camps, or the twin camps. Whatever is meant by the Hebrew Malachim, Jacob sends some of these messengers, as we get into today's portion, to his brother, to Esau. Says that he sends messengers. In fact, this particular Torah portion is called VaYishlach. VaYishlach, because it's about messengers being sent. It begins, VaYishlach Yaakov Malachim. And Jacob sent forth messengers. Now, what are those messengers? I don't know. But we do know that he sends them to meet with his brother. And these messengers come back to Jacob, and they inform him that they did in fact encounter his brother Esau, and they tell Jacob he's coming your way with 400 men. Now you can imagine. This would create a sense of uneasiness. He's already scared. It says in the text that he's afraid. So what does Jacob do? He divides everyone who belongs to him, all his family, his servants, everyone who is with him, into two camps. And we're going to be playing off of this idea, Mahanaim, because the text demands it. The text specifically calls this place Mahanaim. We're going to talk about the reason that the story is talking about two camps, both historically in their sacred history recorded in the Torah, as well as the prophet reading that's therewith associated. So once he does the practical, he divides into two camps. We're we're going to look at what he does next. But let me tell you, the text tells us that he does this for a specific reason. It's that if you had all of them together and there was an attack, you might lose it all. But if you clearly divide into two camps, if one is attacked, the other will escape. That's his plan. Jacob is a schemer. He's a planner. He's good at what he does. And his idea is to set two camps so that some, at least, will survive if things don't go right. And then he prays. Now I want you to look with me at chapter 32 of Genesis, verse 10. Actually, in Hebrew it's going to be verse 9. And Yaakov said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, Jehovah, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will dwell with you. I am unworthy of the least of all the mercies and all the truth which you've shown your servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I'm become two camps. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and smite me, the mother with the children. And you did say, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed like the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. He wraps it up with, by the way, you promised. Now, I love this particular dream, or this prayer. He begins by addressing the God of his fathers, Jehovah, as the one who put forth the patriarchal plan. He's attaching himself to the content of the promises. He lets this God know, I'm following what you told me to do. Very important. You told me to return, and I'm doing it. He then says that he's not even worthy of all the great things that God has done for him. How he began just simply alone, and now he's become two camps. He says, I went out with a staff, and I've come back as two camps. And then Jacob, after praying this prayer, reminding God that he promised him to do him good, to bless him, to multiply him, he's now stated his case in covenant with God, in line with the promise, and he begins to work on the practical things. What does Jacob do? After he prays, he leads his family in these two groups, these two camps, across the wadi, across what is called the Yavok, and he gets them safely across, and then he spends a night, he's alone. And what follows in the text is perhaps the strangest encounter in all of human history. The most interesting thing, perhaps, that has ever happened in the history of man takes place with Jacob alone. Look at chapter 32 of Genesis, beginning in verse 24. I believe in the English it'll be verse 25. And Jacob was left alone. And it says, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Yaakov's thigh was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." And he said, "I will not let thee go unless you bless me." Now, my reading of this is the one with whom he wrestles says, "Let me go, for the day breaks." Jacob is wrestling with what the text calls a man, but he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Yaakov." And he said, "Your name shall no more be called Yaakov, but Israel. For you have contended with God and with men, and have prevailed." And Yaakov asked him, "Tell me, I pray thee, your name." And he said, "Why is it that you dost ask after my name?" And he blessed him there. And Yaakov called the name of that place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. This strange encounter, this match, this struggle, this all-night fight from the darkness through the hours of darkness until the breaking of day, the question in the reader's mind should be, with whom does Jacob wrestle? With whom is Jacob locked through the night in a fight? Commentators provide all sorts of proposals. The great minds that have looked at these texts for centuries, millennia, have said, some have proposed that this is a sort of a representation of Jacob wrestling with his inner self. That like so many other things in the biblical text, it's really a dream. That Jacob's struggle is the fact that he knows that he's done his brother wrong, and he's going and... But what does the text say? The text does say that he wrestles with an ish. Now, an ish in Hebrew is man. So I'm going to look again and point out a couple of things about this very bizarre story. Chapter 32, I want to look at, let's see, verse 29, verse 28 in Hebrew. Your name shall no more be called Yaakov, but Israel, for you have striven with God. In Hebrew, that's im Elohim, ve'im anashim. With Elohim and with men. Jacob's name, Yaakov, implies his character from birth. The story begins with Jacob that we first encounter these two brothers are fighting in the womb, and at the birthing, Jacob grabs the heel of his brother Esau. In Hebrew, a heel is akav. Yaakov grabs the akav of his brother. From the birth, Yaakov is a fighter. This fight that night at the ford, at the wadi, at the Yavok, says that his name is changed to Yisrael. He says, for you have striven in Elohim va'anashim, with God and with men, and have prevailed. And have prevailed. Jacob, maybe others think it's someone else that he wrestles with. Jacob must believe that his opponent in that struggle was divine. How do I know that? He says, he calls the name of that place Peniel. For I have seen God face to face, and my life has been preserved. And Jacob will forever be marked from this struggle. It says that Yaakov walked with a limp after this struggle. Now I want you to go with me to Hosea chapter 12. Hosea chapter 12. And this particular section of Scripture we've covered a few times over the last few weeks because Hosea is focusing on the story of Jacob. And he's bringing out in Hosea chapter 12 certain key elements from the story, the narrative of Jacob. And I think that it's important that we talk about this as we're in the patriarchal narratives, particularly as we are dealing with the life of Jacob. So I want you to look with me. I want to read Hosea chapter 12, verse 3 through 5. Now in the Hebrew it's verse 4 through 6. It says he took, reference Jacob by the way, Yaakov. He took his brother by the heel in the womb, and by his strength he strove with God. He strove with an angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication to him. He would find him in Bethel, and there he would speak with us. But Jehovah, the God of hosts, Jehovah is his name. Jehovah, Elohei Hatzvaot, Jehovah Zikro. This particular passage, according to the prophet Hosea, aligns with what Jacob assumed the morning after. That he struggled with God that night. It says that he strove with God, he strove with a malach. That's interesting, and this is something that we'll get into more perhaps in a dialogue. But remember, it's the malach who tells Jacob, I am the God of Bethel. Very interesting. So when people read here, he strove with God, he strove with an angel, Vayasar el malach, and he fought to the malach. It's like, who is the malach? I mean, the malach is a very interesting, if you do a study of the messenger of the Lord or the angel of the Lord in the Hebrew Scriptures, it ought to raise some questions. I understand that people have certain theologies and certain ideas that they try to explain away certain things in the text which are of most import and most significant and most interesting but some people just won't have it. But this is real. When you read this struggle, Yaakov limps from this day forward. With whom does Jacob struggle? Some don't believe that it actually happened, but I do. Because I believe the text. I think that sometimes the text is so amazing, so incredible, that it seems beyond belief. But what if? It says some translations say, there he met him, and there he spoke with us. It's literally, he found him there, and then the message is with us. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that. I have, for some time, felt that there's some interesting connections between the return of Jacob the patriarch and the prophesied return of his descendants. For example, the descendants of Jacob, we are told in the dream of the ladder at Bethel, the descendants of Jacob, according to the one who spoke with Jacob, he was told they will be spread abroad from the west to the east to the north and the south. And history has obliged. According to the biblical narrative, according to the prophet Amos puts it so succinctly, that they will be scattered throughout all nations as corn is sifted through a sieve, yet not the least grain will fall to the ground. My eyes are on all their ways. Scattered throughout all the nations. Jacob's family, for example, is divided into two camps when the historical patriarch returns to the land promised to his fathers. In fact, the name of the place is Mahanaim. I want you to look with me in Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 1, chapter 6, verse 13 in the English. And I want to tell you that Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, it seems to be interpreting a love story, most commentators would agree, between the man and his lover, but there are texts which seem to cross into the idea of God and his people. Listen to this. In chapter 7, verse 1 of Song of Songs, return, return, shuvi, shuvi, hashulamit, shuvi, shuvi. Return, return, O Shulamit. Return, return, that we may look upon you. What will you see in the Shulamit? As it were the dance of Mahanaim. Now let me tell you something. Shulamit means restored one. This particular text, the restored one, is called for 4 times. I believe these represent the 4 cardinal directions to where they were spread abroad. West, east, north, and south. Return, restored one. And the question is asked, what would you expect to see in this restored one? And the answer is very interesting. As it were, the dance of the twin camps. Two camps. And so it will be prophetically. After the encounter and the all-night struggle, Jacob is transformed into Israel. His name is changed to reflect his life, his purpose. Then and only then can he enter into the land. And only after he instructs his family to put away the idols that they've kept with them up until this point. And I believe that so it will be prophetically. That Israel, coming out of the darkness and out of the struggle, having realized in its two camps that its name has been changed from the supplanter to the one who struggled with God and with men and prevailed, must then put away the idols. And only then they will be allowed to enter in. Now, let's go back and look at Hosea. What does it say? What does Hosea in particular say about the return of Jacob, Israel's descendants? Just as the patriarch returns after the all-night struggle, so too does Hosea speak about the return of Jacob's descendants after relating the fight. Look at Hosea chapter 12 and verse 6. Verse 7 in the Hebrew. Therefore, now this is after Hosea relates the struggle. He says, therefore, turn thou to your God. By the way, in Hebrew, it's shuv. Turn there to your God, keep troth and justice. In Hebrew, it's chesed and mishpat. And wait on your God continually. This is what I want to do. I want to bring in this particular point because Hosea is speaking about the greatest return. He's relating it to the Torah portion that we're studying. He is using the same basic narrative, and then he provides something very interesting. He says, and you, by your God, tashuv, return. In other words, the return is associated with God. Notice the next phrase says, to guard, chesed, and mishpat, words that we should well know. And then he says, hope or wait continually for your God. I believe that these often missed instructions provide a key, if you will. A key that will lead to the return that is prophesied in the Hebrew Bible. Hesed is loving kindness. Mishpat is justice. The descendants of Jacob are told to guard loving kindness and justice. These two words occur with good frequency throughout the Hebrew Bible. and they even represent that which Jehovah delights in. Go with me to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 9. Jeremiah chapter 9 and verse 22. Thus says Jehovah, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might. Let not the rich man glory or boast in his riches, but let him that boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am Jehovah, who exercises, English says, faithful love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, saith Jehovah. In Hebrew, God says, He uses the words chesed and mishpat and tzedakah. These in the earth are what Jehovah delights in. Hosea tells the descendants of Jacob to return, tashuv. He says to guard chesed and mishpat. These are things in which God delights. And then he says to wait continually for your God. The Hebrew word here, kavah, means to wait for, to hope. If you don't see the connection between these two, the idea is to look expectantly, eagerly, with a sense of confident expectation. It's the idea that you're waiting, but it's an active wait. It's an expectant wait. Let me give you a couple of examples of this word and how it's used in Scripture. Go with me to the book of Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 17. Verse 16. Bind up the testimony, seal the Torah among my disciples, and I will wait upon Jehovah that hides his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope for him. This idea of waiting and hoping, it's a sense of expectation. Go with me to the Psalms. Let's look at Psalm 27. Psalm 27 and verse 14. Wait on Jehovah. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. And wait on Jehovah. You see the significance? Wait. Look down, let's see. Hang on, let's back up on verse 13. Were it not that I believed I should see the goodness of Jehovah in the land of the living, wait on Jehovah, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart, and wait on Jehovah. I wanted to bring that in about the inheritance of the land. Now look at chapter 37, Psalm 37, and verse 9. For evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait on Jehovah, they shall inherit the land. See, as Jacob is preparing to inherit the land, he's been promised certain things by the God who called him and told him to return. Hosea is bringing the historical narrative into a prophetic scenario And he's associating the entrance back into the land, the inheritance of the land, with three things, and waiting on Jehovah is one. Psalm 37, verse 9, says the same. They who wait on Jehovah shall inherit the earth. Look at verse 34 of Psalm 37. Wait on Jehovah and keep or guard his way, and he shall exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, you shall see it. Once again, waiting on Jehovah, guarding his way, which has always got justice in it, guarantees the possession of the land. You see the connection. Now I want you to go with me back to Isaiah chapter 40. Many of you probably know this passage. I want to read Isaiah chapter 40, beginning in verse 27. Why sayest thou, O Yaakov, and speak, O Israel, my way is hid from Jehovah, and my judgment is passed over from my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard that the everlasting God, Jehovah, the creator of the ends of the earth, faints not, nor is he weary? There's no searching of his understanding. He gives power to the faint, and to the powerless he creates, increases strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But they that wait upon Jehovah shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. To wait upon Jehovah, to guard Hesed and Mishpat, lead to the return of Jacob's seed to the land of promise, to the return. May we all find strength in these words according to the prophets. Many blessings. Shabbat Shalom. Now we'll take a few minutes and move our operation over to the United Israel Center South. So if you're local and you slept in this morning and you want to make it, you've got a little bit of time, jump in your car right now. You can meet us over there. If you're watching us online, you'll see when we post the next link. So Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for spending the morning with us.